camera never lies, you know, and mirrors are no better. Cheaters never win, they say, they leave your heart in fetters. Beauty's only skin deep, they say, eye of the beholder. But angels seem to spend their time looking over their shoulder. Everybody wants to disappear, everybody wants to fly. They say anyone can find their wings. Yes, I close my eyes and feel for mine. Can't run away from who I am, can't keep my pride and hang my head. Can't change the world to match my inside. Stop on a dime and change my ways. Walk through the walls out of this maze. Got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. It's time I find myself. It's time I find myself. It's time
I'm home.
Hey guys, welcome back.
Hey.
I just noticed the Play-Doh on his
What happened to the geek room?
desk is
What do you
owned
mean?
by Birdie.
Why is everything around here different?
Some of the more
You
recent
bought an HD camera.
of Marvel Comics.
Everything does look nicer.
Or out the window, you have Carol Dane versus.
That's
Captain
true.
Marvel. It's a nice
All right.
little
Better
cover.
question. Better question.
I looked at
Where
some other
is
comics as well,
my table?
but this was
On
my
the
favorite.
patio?
Over
Anyway.
there, where it's always been.
Kind of interesting. Starts with Howard in jail, of course. This is a fairly common thing
Fine.
for him. Introduces a new character by the name of Kara.
Dear Misters Whitley and Peterson and Miss Vernon, one of the things that I contend as a driving reason for writing these letters is that I think it's important that comic books be treated in the same way that we treat other forms of literature. They are valid texts that can explore a number of different themes, ideas, and schools of thought, so it's important that we actually do that. In order to put my money where my mouth is, as it were, I've decided to do a few close readings of your work and try to tease a little meaning out of it. I'll be applying literary theory from various schools in order to gain a greater appreciation of your comics. Let me start by explaining what close reading is. People who weren't English majors might not understand, but a close reading is a detailed examination of a text. Text meaning any creative work being examined, so it applies to songs, paintings, movies, etc. just as much as it does to prose and poetry, usually from a particular literary school. Lit theory is about learning the concepts that guide those schools and applying them to texts. I should point out here that I'm not trying to say that what I interpret is what the author meant, or that these messages were intentionally put into these stories. I'm not saying they weren't either. Lit theory doesn't care about the author's intent unless you're reading from the authorial intent or new criticism school. The general idea is that once the text is out of the hands of the author, it's up to the reader to derive meaning from it, and the assumptions they start with will reflect the way that they interpret the same events. Just as an example, look at the movie Frozen. Some people say it has messages about LGBT acceptance buried in the story, while others think it holds up virtues of platonic and familial love over all else. Some people look at Hans and see a master manipulator. Some see him as so devoid of personality that his only option is to always mimic the emotions of the person he's speaking to. Some see Elsa's transformation during Let It Go as a symbol of empowerment. Others see her as just miming yet another outside ideal of what she should be. And the thing is, there isn't a right answer, nor should there be. Art is meant to affect us in a variety of ways, some subtle, some not so much. And our lives to that point will color the way we see things. So, just to reiterate, I'm not saying that this is the meaning of these texts, only some meanings given a certain set of perspectives. Also, to address accusations of reading too much into these, this is what scholars do with art. It helps us gain a greater acceptance for it, not to mention it's a lot of fun when you get good at it. Finally, this isn't a review, so I'm not going to follow all of these with my opinions on whether they're good or not. In fact, I'll say right now, these are all great and I highly recommend reading them. Literary criticism isn't about pronouncing things good or bad, it's about trying to figure out what they mean. Okay, now that we're all on the same page, let's jump right in. Princeless is the story of Princess Adrian, a young woman who lives in a world where all princesses are put in locked towers guarded by beasts upon reaching marriageable age, there to wait until a prince arrives to rescue her and they are married. Unhappy with this prospect, Adrian climbs out of her tower, tames her guard dragon, and has gone on a quest to rescue her sisters from their towers. It's both silly fun and full of heart, a great read all around. Now, what school will we be reading this from? No, too easy. How about... There we go. Post-colonial criticism is generally applied to text written in or about countries that were once the province of European colonial powers. The idea is that once a country is colonized, its culture is irrevocably changed by the imposition of the colonizing country's culture, so that even once that foreign element has been eliminated, there will always remain aspects of it that have been accepted as part of the new normal. In this case, there's ample evidence that the kingdom Adrian's father rules was once a colonized power, probably for a long time and not necessarily very long ago. The book opens with a story about a blonde-haired, blue-eyed princess who is locked in a tower and rescued by a handsome prince so they might live happily ever after. We then see the stories being read by the queen to a very young Princess Adrian who comments that the whole idea is stupid, pointing out the obvious plot holes. That is when we learn that this is no mere story but how this kingdom actually works, imprisoning their daughters for eventual rescue. The reason why this is notable is twofold. The first is that the appearance of the princess in the story doesn't in any way match the appearance of Adrian, or her mother, or her father, sisters, and brother. Most obviously, the ruling family is black and none have blonde hair or blue eyes. Usually stories told to children are written to mirror the child, make them feel like the story is about them, especially to impart a lesson, and also stories that permeate cultures tend to reflect the general appearances and behaviors of the culture and people in charge of it. In both cases, this keeps the attention of the listener and makes any lessons imparted by the fable hit home more closely. That this story with this description is so ingrained that not even the Queen of the Realm thinks to change it to better reflect her daughter suggests that the ideal image of beauty and purity that the princess in the tower represents was shaped by an outside culture that valued those traits rather than dark hair and eyes, for example. The other reason this is notable is that we see how the Queen has to struggle to answer Adrian's very reasonable questions. The reason why they lock their daughters in towers is because they have always done so. There's an explanation about only wanting the best for their daughters and seeing this as a test of worth for potential suitors, but Adrian counters that this makes no sense. There are, of course, many measures of worth, and we see from the king throughout the book that he recognizes this when his children aren't concerned, so it's not a huge leap to suggest that this isn't his idea. It's the idea of colonial powers that are no longer around, but left a legacy that demands certain behaviors from royal men and women. Race plays a big part in this story, with Adrian especially being very aware of her dark skin and getting quite upset when men refer to her as fair. These men think fair means beautiful. She points out that fair means white. The truth is that it means both in this context, and again we see a cultural relic from a time in this kingdom's history when the whiter your skin was, the more beautiful you were considered. The irony, of course, is that Adrian's rebellion against these cultural norms which reinforce negative attitudes about her and people like her is met with resistance by her father, who is determined to stop the, quote, mysterious knight, end quote, that is trying to wipe away cultural bias against people like him and his family. He is so committed to the system and how it works that he'll even defend things that would make things harder for him and his family were he not king. Further evidence for Ashland, the kingdom in question, once being a colonized nation, comes in the second volume of the trade when we get to see flashbacks of King Ash and the Black Knight fighting, and talking about even earlier events in which they fought together for the land in question. That the kingdom is named after the king suggests one of two things. Either King Ash's parents named him after their kingdom, which when you consider names like Virginia or Georgia is not that out of the question, or once he took control of the kingdom, he immediately named it after himself. In either case, this gives us a clue as to the traits he has adopted from the colonial oppressors. King Ash is, himself, a colonizer. That is best exemplified by his tense relationship with the werewolves in the forest, one with a treaty that both sides expect the other will violate at any time. In this case, Whitley does an excellent job of really writing tension very well, but it shows us that Ash has to fight his instincts if he intends to not make enemies that he knows he can't handle, that live in his borders and can easily prevent travel along a major route. Going back to beauty standards, one might ask, but if whiteness is so prized in Ashland, why is Princess Angelica considered the most beautiful girl in the kingdom? Excellent query, hypothetical person. The answer's quite simple. She is beautiful and new. One might make an argument for fetishization, but I don't think there's enough evidence for that. Rather, I think it's more accurate to say that while the standard for beauty is blonde over blue with fair skin, Angelica is both very beautiful and somewhat rare in a kingdom that has until recently not really paid much attention to its people of color. Suddenly here's this blemish-free, well-proportioned, Fibonacci-faced woman that also looks unlike the women with similar traits that would have been noticed previous to the ascension of King Ash. What we see in Princeless is not just Princess Adrian fighting against entrenched opinions about women. She's fighting against a culture that appears to have been imposed upon her kingdom by an outside force that has become so common that a mother can't even see how telling her daughter a bedtime story in which the most beautiful girl in the world looks nothing like her might be at least a little questionable. Ashland is still struggling to throw off a cultural legacy that is harmful to its citizens on a number of levels, and has a ruler that is unwittingly battling his own daughter in order to maintain a social order that hurts her and his entire family. Okay, let's see what else we have on the Wheel of Lit Criticism. Okay, this should be fun. A Marxist reading sees a text in terms of class and ideology, examining how the characters react to one another based on their relative social status and in light of their history as well as economic factors. Before we begin, let me reiterate that I'm not saying this is what the author intended. In fact, I can say with some level of certainty that this has never entered the author's head. This comic is super silly and fun and all about just how awesome comics are. We're playing a literary game. This is what English majors do for fun when we're not getting into ritualized combat regarding Oxford comma use. Very Near Mint is the story of Colin and Sam, a couple of guys who own a comic shop called The Splash Page. Hijinks ensue. I should mention I'm working from volume 1 of the trade, so I haven't had a chance to read further yet, and if things happen to contradict things established at this point, I have no way of knowing. This is the text I'm working with. The very first thing that we are shown is a delivery of comics heading to the stores when they spontaneously catch on fire, leaving the splash page without new comics for a Wednesday. This is presented as the most terrifying possible scenario, as there will be a number of fanboys on their way to the store in order to pick up this week's pull list items, and Sam suggests that they may get violent without it, even leaving new employee Nate to try and handle them. The fanboys themselves are presented for the most part as zombies in a very Dawn of the Dead way, making the same point that the need for consumption drives us to deny our own humanity. In this case, our need to buy turns us into dangerous creatures that abandon reason in human life. Colin is a particularly interesting study in this, in that his solution is actually somewhat unorthodox. He goes to a comic shop across town that actually did get their comics and buys off the shelf. Obviously there's no way to make money off this, but it doesn't bother Colin because he has a very loose association both with capital and reality. By being a slacker with very little in the way of depth as a human being, Colin actually rises above the realities of capitalism in that he can run a store while having no idea how buying and selling works. Sure, Sam probably does most of the actual work, but in this case we see symbolically that Colin simply denies reality and substitutes his own. That is until the other comic store prevents him from buying when they find out why he wants so many copies of everything. This is reality smacking Colin to reassert itself, especially since the action is nonsensical. The other comic shop makes money if he buys them all. They make no money if they deny him service. The main story arc of the first volume is that another comic shop, Across the Street Comics, opens up across the street from the splash page. It soon is made clear that a mysterious figure not only owns Across the Street Comics, but also that he is opening it as a specific attempt to ruin Colin and Sam. The mysterious figure spends the rest of the volume not only slowly chipping away at the main character's sanity, but at their possessions. He threatens the business of the splash page with his comic and toy superstore. He buys out their building so that he can order the two of them out of their apartment. He has his goon, usually called Goon, offer Nate a job that would not only pay better, but would show more respect for the value of his work than he was getting at the splash page, where he's often asked to do humiliating or dangerous tasks. In short, the villain's using capitalism to crush his enemies. We eventually learn that his motivation is also based on capitalism. Our villain spent most of his life building a comic collection of every comic printed. Just run with it. When he went to have his collection graded, though, an issue of one of the comics had a bent corner due to poor bagging on the part of Colin, leading the collection to be graded as very near mint rather than mint. The value placed on his collection by an outside force that determines worth had deemed his life's work imperfect, so rather than rely on a panel of experts, the villain turns to capitalism to be his weapon. In the market, something is worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it, so selling his collection gave this villain nearly unlimited power to get revenge on Colin. Wealth and power are treated interchangeably here, and possession is considered a motive to ruin a person's life. The Illuminati has an interesting approach to this as well. While markets ought to be able to self-regulate, at least in theory, Very Near Mint presents us with a collective of pop culture game shop owners who meet in order to discuss business and present unified efforts regarding how they conduct their operations. This might be considered a pool during the trust-busting times of the first Roosevelt era in the United States, which is to say a collective of business owners who subvert competition by plotting out unified action that keeps prices high. Think of them as the mirror inverse of unions. In this case, though, even the subversive nature of the Illuminati is further denigrated when we find out that the villain has purchased all of the other stores, leaving only the splash page between it and a monopoly on pop culture in the city. In an ironic twist, the store that had a generally low opinion of its customers and employees becomes the only thing preventing across-the-street comics from being able to do the same with impunity. Well, that was interesting. How about we look at one of my favorite comics of all time, Digger. And let's give it a... Come on, eco-criticism. Come on, eco-criticism. You can do it! Well, that's a thing that's about to happen. Digger is the story of Digger of Unnecessarily Convoluted Tunnels. Digger for short. A wombat who wakes up after running into some bad air, having dug herself someplace that she doesn't recognize far from home. She surfaces in the village of Wrath, where she makes a diverse roster of friends, enemies, and people in between, while almost everybody struggles with who they are. I normally don't care much about spoilers, and will give a spoiler warning and just let it be at that point, but I'm going to try very, very hard not to spoil this for you, especially since there's a major plot twist that I want to talk about, but instead I'll try to give you enough fodder so that when you read this, which you should since it was originally published as a webcomic and remains free online here, and you get to that part, you'll be able to make that last connection. It's one of my favorite moments in comics, like in the top 5. As much as I normally don't care about spoilers personally, I think you guys going in blind will help make the impact that much better. Either way, I'm reading from the Kickstarter Omnibus Edition, which, as the author/artist has stated, you could bludgeon somebody to death with, but you'd really have to make an effort at it. One of the most important ideas to consider in the course of reading Digger is how many of the characters either struggle with a sense of self or have purposely exiled a part of themselves in an effort to focus on a particular task. Digger herself starts the story with no personality to speak of. She's practical, like most wombats, and a good engineer, like most wombats. And that's really about it. She stresses when she talks to people how typical she is of wombat society, and her particularly deep thinking is almost entirely composed of sayings and stories that she heard from other people. She hasn't been called to adventure in the monomyth sense, but is rather asked to solve the problem of adventure in the most efficient way possible. And adventure isn't letting her get away with it that easily. The first person that she meets is a talking statue of Ganesha. It's important to note here that the statue makes a distinction between itself and the real Ganesha, though it seems that nobody else does. The statue knows who it is, a somewhat rare thing in this universe. Digger goes off to get a better idea of where she is when she meets the second person, a hyena in a cave. At first the hyena tries to eat her, but when that fails he offers her hospitality, and we learn that this particular hyena has no name. Now we meet the first character with truly no symbolic identity in the story, who claims that his name has been eaten, a reference to the ceremony among his people for exile. As a point of clarification, I'm using the pronoun he, but this hyena, whom Digger names Ed, calls himself it through much of the story, only replacing all pronoun use with Ed after being given the name. This is an incredibly powerful gesture that Digger doesn't understand the significance of, both in terms of hyena culture and meta-narrative. By bestowing a name on a character, she is imbuing that character with a whole raft of responsibility and expectations. To him, and to us as readers, she has made him significant where he was nobody previously. In later scenes, when Ed is with other hyenas, we see him revert back to the quiet, wilting nobody he is before Digger gives him a name, even using the it pronoun to describe himself again. Another character that is without identity before Digger's intervention is Shadowchild. Nobody's quite sure what it is, least of all, it. Much of its early dialogue is asking Digger what something is and then asking if it is that thing. Shadowchild's development over the course of the story is to start choosing what it wants to be, making active decisions to ignore what others tell it, and instead forging its own destiny. The Veiled are a particularly interesting examination of how people in Wrath relate to one another and to themselves. In the case of this order, they serve all gods and hide their faces behind veils so that said gods cannot recognize them and come to rely on a particular person. In this case, we see an organization that's chosen to abjure individuality in order to better raise the collective, allowing their virtue to identify them. Of course, very rarely is hiding one's face a symbol of virtue in literature, and we eventually see that the Veiled, specifically in the person of their leader Jalm, are just as prone to act in self-interest as they are in the interest of the gods. In fact, the very idea of serving all gods is a bit absurd, since even a cursory look at mythology shows that gods are often in conflict. While the veil is meant to erase the identity of those who wear it so that they might be the hands of the gods, it ends up hiding their culpability in a string of selfish actions, so much so that at one point Jalm unilaterally declares the statue of Ganesha to no longer be accurately speaking for the real god and therefore can be ignored. The Hag is another character that has given up something of who she is in order to better do what she does. The character is the Healer of Wrath and uses the title The Hag rather than a name to reflect that. It should be noted that she is neither old nor wizened as the name implies, but a clever young woman who knows more about medicine than anyone else in town. She has given up her name, which is to say her identity, to be the person who fulfills the role of her title. Finally, let's talk about the skin lizards. These are lizards that live underground and wear the preserved skins of creatures they have killed. This is a holy thing for them and represents a continuing on of life after death. Everybody eventually dies, but if their skin goes on, then they can live forever. Further, it is implied that wearing a preserved skin gives the wearer certain traits from the former owner, such as their bravery or their intelligence. These types of animist beliefs are reflected in the hyena society, where the liver is considered to be the origin of emotion and the seat of bravery, so eating the liver of a fallen enemy will bestow their courage upon you. There is more to the reflection in that the skin lizards live underground, are generally cowardly, and absorb the powers of others from the outside in, and the hyenas are a warrior society that lives above ground and absorb the powers of others from the inside out. These sorts of reflections are prevalent in the motifs of the story, especially with the extensive use of shadows. Carl Jung suggested the shadow archetype is the part of the ego that we intrinsically reject. It is us, but is the parts of us that we don't acknowledge, which in most cases are the negative parts. Many of the characters are selves and shadow self-reflections, including Jalm and Mirai, Ed and Grim Eyes, and of course He Is and She Is, which we will cover shortly. A dark god hides beneath the ground in wrath, and Lord Ganesha the Compassionate resides above. Perhaps the most subtle of these is Shadow Child, who is a literal shadow. But whose? Well, almost certainly Digger's. When we first meet it, Shadow Child does not know what it is, which is reflective of Digger, who has no personality of her own. Shadow Child is also as curious as Digger is incurious, and it should be noted that the Jungian archetype suggests that the shadow may also be where creativity lies. As the story progresses and Digger develops an identity that goes beyond, I'm a wombat, so too does Shadow Child develop a sense of self. When Digger decides that she can make her own choices and be heroic, even if it's not practical, Shadow Child also gains the ability to choose for itself. Jung is particularly helpful in this when you also consider the anima and animus. In most basic terms, the anima is the totality of traditionally feminine traits possessed by men, and the animus is the totality of traditionally masculine traits possessed by women. While these definitions are somewhat arbitrary and reductive, they will serve for our purposes now. The hyena creation myth of He Is and She Is embodies many of the Jungian concepts present in this story. In this case, we have an archetypal first male and female. One of the things that is particularly interesting about Vernon's research into this is that hyena society, both in reality and in this story, is matriarchal, with the females of the species being larger and stronger than the males by and large. While not depicted in the comic, alpha female hyenas, due to increased androgen in their systems, often have a pseudopenis up to 7 inches long, which Jung would likely consider to be extremely significant. In the creation myth, He Is and She Is are the hyena tribe, 2 people making one entity. And when She Is becomes pregnant, a demon convinces He Is to take control of her because she is weaker, and his fear of losing her and the baby ironically drive him to attempt to kill her. He loses and is exiled with only the demon for company. In this case, the roles are reversed. The anima controls most hyena men and the animus most hyena women. So when the demon attempts to draw the animus out of He Is, making him uncontrollably quote-unquote masculine, it ends up destroying him. He Is never moves past the first stage of animus development, man of mere physical power, whereas She Is embodies the Sophia stage of anima development, having achieved wisdom. This reversal is part of what works so well about Digger and eventually comes to a head at the end when these conflicting collections of personality traits are thrown together to see what shakes out. In either case, we also see that He Is, while once a part of She Is, and vice versa, becomes She Is' shadow self, the manifestation of everything she ignored about the shared person they once were. By the end of the story, we see that everybody has found some sense of self. In many cases, they have learned to strike a balance between opposing forces within themselves, they have learned to accept their own choices, or they have become fully a person when they were not one before. This is such a rich story that I could probably talk about it even longer, but this letter is long enough, and I think it may be time to wrap things. Very few stories are what they appear to be on their face. We cannot help, as humans, coding a part of ourselves in the structure and characters of our fiction. What makes these people compelling is that we recognize ourselves, our struggles, and our very lives at times in the actions of these characters. It's because good stories follow patterns that we recognize, having learned them over the course of our lives, and those patterns give the stories meaning that we can understand and apply to gain a better awareness of the world. Thank you very much for your work, ladies and gentlemen. I enjoyed it all and hope to continue to, whether in extensions of these stories or in other ones. I hope that others will be able to get as much out of your work as I have, perhaps applying other schools of thoughts, and that you keep making such incredible comics. Sequentially yours, Karu.
As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. I haven't looked for you all my days. As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. And all this while you were waiting along the way. So let this be a testimony of how far I would go to bring you home. And let each day be our victory and the sweetest time that we've ever known. Quédate, por favor, por favor, quédate conmigo. Останься, пожалуйста, пожалуйста, останься со мной. No.
Hi everybody. I know that I only have 8 fans. I really should be able to talk to all of you, but there's one person right now that I would like to send a special message to. My biggest fan. Debbie, I have a confession to make. There are times when I make myself some ramen, and I ask if you want any, and you say no, but I'm tempted to put too much hot sauce in mine because I know that if I don't, you're going to eat half of mine. But I've never done that because I want to share everything that I have with you. And there are times when I don't want to go to yoga, even though I know I need to get healthier so that I can spend more years with you. But I always do, because those years are worth every painful minute in every pose. And there are times when I doubt that I deserve somebody as amazing as you. But then I remember that you have impeccable taste. It's one of the things that I love most about you. I got so lucky when we met. And the fact that you love me as much as you do is almost heartbreakingly amazing every time I think of it. So, I suppose what I'm saying is, Debbie, will you do the thing for the rest of our lives? I can't look. Wow. Somebody tell me if she said yes. Just put a thumbs up or a comment or something down there. And wow. So I think we'll just let them have their thing now. But yeah, that was it. Thank you for indulging me, and take care.